Ivan Club, and okay, I will start again. Hello, my name is Ruben, and I'm part of the Ivan Club board. I am glad to introduce to Christian Sevier. With a career of more than 30 years in international logistics, Christian started a Montreal-based import-export consultancy in 2010, Solimpex. He's a consultant and trainer in logistics, customs and regulatory aspects of international trade, free trade agreements, supply chain management, and related issues. Christian also is a lecturer in conference, seminars, webinars, and personalized trainings, and continuously collaborating with multiple trade organizations, such as the Montreal Chamber of Commerce, Invest Ottawa, Supply Chain Canada, and similars. Today, he's here to guide us through CUSMA, an exchange from NAFTA, previous Canada Free Trade Agreement with United States and Mexico. Welcome, Christian. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you very much, Ruben, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to your group. I'm really happy to be here. It's an unusual. We live in unusual times, and we have a pandemic, as we all know. We also so today we're going to talk about trade with the U.S. and Mexico, and just on the same week. I'm sorry.
No, sorry. We are very glad to have you today. Thank you for your time.
Thank
you. Just before you start your presentation, I just want to explain the dynamic for the questions and answer.
Of course, yes, sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you, sorry about that. In the chat, Perla will post a link where you can type in your questions, and those will be answered at the end of the presentation in the order they appear. So Christian, sorry for the interruption, the space is yours.
No problem. Thank you, Ruben. So thank you, everyone, for being here and for inviting me to speak. We are, as I was saying, we are in odd times with the pandemic, but we're in even more unusual times, because as we're going to talk about trade with the US, our trade is currently halted because of a small group of well-organized individuals who are blocking the border access, blocking the bridge, the ambassador bridge between Quebec and Ontario, and occupying the our national capital in Ottawa. So it's a very odd circumstance. We're going to talk about trade, and our trade right now is halted. There's no trade because there's no traffic going through, and we don't know how this is going to last. So CUSMA, NAFTA, why do we have the different languages, the different terminology? We used to have a NAFTA, which I think from a Canadian and US perspective was practical because it was the same name. So now what's odd is that we have the USMCA, as it's called in the US. We have the CUSMA in Canada, and we have TMEC in Mexico. And that simply comes from the fact that the former US president wanted to put the US first. And so while the agreement was renegotiated, he insisted on calling it the United States Mexico agreement, Mexico-Canada agreement. And then, of course, the Canadians said, why should we put the United States first? We'll put Canada first. So we'll call it the Canada-United States Mexico agreement. And then, of course, in Mexico, we said, no es posible. So let's put Mexico first. So that's why it's called TMEC. So the renegotiation of NAFTA was quite difficult. It took quite a while. So I don't need to introduce myself because it was done already. But before I skip this slide, I just wanted to point you to two publications that you may already know. If you don't know them, I invite you to look them up. Inside Logistics and Supply Professional, they are quite fine publications. They're Canadian publications from Toronto, and they're free. And so I invite you to look them up, subscribe to the newsletters. They have nice content dealing with international trade, supply chain management, et cetera, et cetera. So I was starting to talk about how the negotiations were quite difficult, mainly because of the former US president who before that, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. Briefly, I want to tell you, Perla probably can tell you about it also. I have a program of conferences with Invest Ottawa where we talk about international trade. I think Perla attended one of them. So I just wanted to share the agenda with you, or the calendar. So In case you're interested, I can send you the link so you can also look them up on the Invest Ottawa website. The neat thing about them is that they are free. So just for your information, in case any of you are interested, look it up on the Invest Ottawa website, calendar of events. That's the program we have for our international trade workshop. So going back to the US, and before we drill into the US specifically, I just wanted to remind us that we have free trade agreements with many other countries. With small countries or relatively small countries like Israel, Chile, Costa Rica, but also the last ones at the bottom are with huge zones, huge areas. The one with the European Union that links us with 27 European Union countries. And then we also have the Trans-Pacific Partnership that puts us with or links us with 10 Pacific countries. And so we're well equipped with trade agreements actually at this time for Canadian exports. How important is the US? Well, it represents about 3/4 of our exports year after year. These are 2019 stats. I think the 2020 stats are more or less the same. And, I said to myself, I want to forget about 2020 anyway, because of the pandemic. So that's why I kept the 2019 stats. So very important market. The US also supplies about 55 to 60% of our imports, of our inbound supplies. That's why during the NAFTA renegotiations, things were very difficult because we had this, the former president who wanted to renegotiate NAFTA on his conditions, at all costs. And he even threatened to cancel NAFTA, which was very bad for Canada and would be very bad also for Mexico. He qualified NAFTA as the worst ever trade deal made. Then when the renegotiation was successful, then he qualified the USMCA as the best ever trade deal. So that could lead us to believe that the CUSMA agreement or the USMCA or the TMAC is different from NAFTA, but in fact is very similar. It's really the USMCA or CUSMA or TMAC is a cut and paste of NAFTA. There are changes, but they're not huge at all. So this is what we're going to drill into. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background very briefly. The renegotiations took place in 2018-19, and then it was signed, but then in 2019, but then in the summer, but then it took a while to get it ratified. Mexico ratified it first. The US ratified it in December and January 2019, and Canada had always said that they would ratify it once the US had ratified it. So that's why Canada ratified it last. And then because the ratification was on March 13, 2020, because the implementation date or delay was to be 3 months, that's the reason why the new NAFTA, the CUSMA agreement, has been in effect or was implemented on July 1st, 2020. On Canada Day. So we had 2 good news on July 1st, 2020. Just to give it a brief historical perspective, you might recognize some people here. The previous agreement, the NAFTA, had been signed in 92, put into effect in 94. It always takes a little bit of time between signature and ratification. Before NAFTA was put into place, before 1994, there was a Canada-US trade agreement to which Mexico was not a part of. So it was purely Canada-US in 1987, so before NAFTA. And before that, what's interesting is we had a trade agreement that was specific to the automobile industry between Canada and the US. That was in 1965. So that was called the Auto Pact. Now that's very important because this really was the beginning of the close integration of the Canadian and US automobile industry. And then of course, Mexico joined. So So our three countries are closely integrated as far as the automobile industry. So automobile assemblies as well as automobile parts. So that really was the beginning of this free trade agreement, really was the Auto Pact. And it's ironic because the industry that's the most affected by the changes in the new agreement is the automobile industry. In BC, we might not be too aware of that, but we have quite a huge automobile industry in Canada. We have at least 6 companies that have assembly lines. They're all in Ontario. Why are they in Ontario? Is because, and they're on the western part of Ontario, on the western side, and that's because it's across from Detroit, which, as you know, used to be the world capital of the automobile industry, years ago. And so that's why we have this huge automobile industry in Canada, and it's all in Ontario. And we also have, you may not know this, we also have a truck assembly line in Ontario from Hino, the Hino trucks. Some of the Hino trucks you see on the highways, they're small trucks. They are assembled in Canada, and Hino is a brand that's owned by Toyota, by the way. So just to highlight the fact that the automobile industry and the automotive industry is extremely important for the Canadian economy and in the context of NAFTA as well. And so briefly, what I want to share with you also, I want to talk to you or show you as many practical things as possible. And also I want to share with you some things that I think are sometimes not well known. And so the first thing is that I want to explain to you how free trade agreements work in practice as far as the trading of goods is concerned. You know, the main advantage of a trade agreement is that we have 0% tariffs or customs duties on products, which makes these products more competitive. But for that, we have rules of origin. Why do we have rules of origin? Is because, you know, with globalization, any manufactured products that you can think of, whether it's automobiles or electronics or toys or furniture, there's always some foreign components. And so we don't want products that have foreign component to be disqualified under a free trade agreement. We still want them to be qualified, but we want to have specific rules. And so there is not one rule for one free trade agreement. There are slightly different rules that are based on the products. Each product has slightly different rules. So we call them product-specific rules of origin. And so I'm going to explain that to you a little bit, because I know from experience that that aspect of trade agreements is not always well known. And the last element is the certificate of origin. When an exporter, a manufacturer, an exporter produces goods and verifies that they are acceptable for the trade agreement, they comply with the rules of origin, then you have to supply, the exporter has to supply a certificate of origin that is used for customs clearance in the country of destination to be able to get the duty-free treatment on the products. Now, why do I want to talk to you about rules of origin? Well, it's because several surveys were done that highlight the fact that sometimes companies don't take full advantage of free trade agreements. And so this survey, and there's several surveys, I'm showing you one from Thomson Reuters, but there was one done in Japan, there was also some done in Europe, to the effect that free trade agreements are not fully utilized by companies. And one of the reasons, if you see what's circled at the bottom left, one of the reasons is that people feel that rules of origin are too complicated and the document requirements are too complex and hard to administer. So that's why I want to take a few minutes to explain to you how rules of origin work in free trade agreements, so that you have a better understanding of that, because it's my experience that not everybody understands that. Even companies that export a lot don't fully understand how the rules of origin are structured. And so this is a typical rule of origin on, or the rules of origin for tools that are in chapter 82. And as you can see, if you're a specialist, they seem to be very clear, right? But if you're not a specialist, they seem very confusing and hard to follow, hard to understand. Unless you tell me that they are very clear to you and you understand them fully and there's no problem. But I think for most people, rules of origin are difficult to understand. And that's why I want to take the time to explain them to you a little bit. First of all, To understand rules of origin, you have to be a little bit familiar with something called the HS code. The HS code is an international numbering system of products that is organized and managed by the World Customs Organization in Brussels. 10 digits. The first 6 digits are international. And so every product that we can think of has an HS code tied to it, and we use that for customs clearance, for customs purposes. And this is how customs tariffs and duties are calculated. They're calculated based on the HS code of the product. And so the Canadian HS code, we looked that up on the CBSA website. It has been updated at the beginning of the year, actually, so there has been changes. And so that's the first key to free trade agreements, understanding the HS code and how it's structured and etc. And the second factor is that a product can be made out of foreign components as long as it's transformed enough during the manufacturing process, then it will qualify for the free trade agreement. So for example, if you take aluminium, which we have Kitimat in BC, right? We have a large production of aluminium, but the raw material for aluminium is not Canadian. The raw material for aluminium is bauxite. It comes mainly from Africa, and there's some also coming from Indonesia, I think. And so bauxite is the foreign raw material that we use to produce aluminium. And but the key here is that using imported raw materials is okay as long as you transform it enough. So you see, when you manufacture aluminium, you've transformed bauxite and you made a different product. Now, how do you demonstrate that, or how do you prove that or illustrate that, is with the HS code. So you see your HS code for bauxite is 260600. Your HS code for aluminium sheets or ingots is 760110. So from a free trade agreement perspective, the aluminium has been transformed enough in order to, or the raw material has been transformed enough and the product will qualify. And now, if you were a window or door manufacturer in Vancouver or in BC or anywhere in Canada, you could also import your aluminium sheets or ingots from elsewhere and then transform them to manufacture doors or windows. So you'd have a different HS code. So you see here again, the aluminium sheets, the raw material has an HS code 760110. And your windows and doors have an HS code 761010. So the HS codes are different. And now, in this case, actually, it may be problematic because maybe the HS code is not different enough, because aluminium ingots and sheets and aluminium windows are in chapter 76 of the HS code. So there are tricky situations, but this is how the principle works. And I want to illustrate it all again on something else, which is part of NAFTA and CUSMA, and that hasn't changed in CUSMA, is if you're exporting, if you're making cookies, in BC or anywhere in Canada, you're making cookies and you want to be sure they comply with the CUSMA rules of origin. So the rule of origin actually for cookies, it just calls for a change of HS code at the heading level, and it just says your raw materials can be foreign, can be imported, so long as they are not in the same chapter of the HS code. So you see, this is how we relate to the transformation of a product to the HS code. And so, for example, if you're making cookies in BC, you could import your flour from Europe. You could import your cocoa beans from Cameroon or Ivory Coast. You could import your sugar from Brazil or the Dominican Republic. Import your butter from Australia or New Zealand. Have all imported ingredients, but your cookie would still qualify for CUSMA because you transformed the raw material enough. And the demonstration of that is that all the raw materials, the imported raw materials, are not in the same chapter as the cookies. The cookies are in chapter 19, and your raw materials are from other chapters. So it's okay. Your Canadian, your cookie can be 0% Canadian as far as ingredients, but it still qualifies for CUSMA because it was transformed, because it was baked. It was all the ingredients were mixed and baked in Canada. So then that would be okay. So On the other hand, just to understand how this change of HS code works and to illustrate it further, if you can't import cookies and just put chocolate chips on top, then that wouldn't work. You wouldn't qualify because your imported cookies are in chapter 19. So then that doesn't work anymore. You haven't transformed them enough. So this is how rules of origin work in free trade agreements. And the second element is what's called the regional value content. And so I get companies, I do consulting work also for exporters who call me to validate that they use the right documents or that they have the right, they do the right calculations, and that also to confirm that their product meets the rules of origin, that their product is Canadian enough. So what's interesting and what's important is that when you manufacture a product and you export it in the free trade zone, in the free trade agreement zone, you don't just consider the Canadian content, you also consider the content from the other countries that are part of the free trade agreement. And to illustrate that, these skidoos, we use in winter in Canada, where there's enough snow for that. They are stinky machines. They make a lot of noise, but people use them a lot. They're made in Canada from components that are Canadian, American, Mexican. BRP, the company that makes them, has a factory in Mexico. They also have parts from Europe. They also have parts from Asia. And so the way they do their calculation to be sure that the product complies with the rules of origin, they don't just take the Canadian content. They also take the US content and the Mexican content, and they add the three of them up to come to the percentage of regional content. So you see, this is something important to understand. Many companies don't know this. This is how free trade agreements work. If you're exporting this skidoo to Japan, then you cannot take the US content or the Mexican content in the calculation. You can only take the Canadian content. If you're exporting them to Europe, you can only take the Canadian content. And if you have European content, you can add that, but you cannot consider the US or the Mexican content because the US and Mexico are not part of the CETA free trade agreement with the European Union. So this is how things work. And so here we are able to understand a little bit better how free trade agreements rules are structured. You see when they refer to a change to heading, from chapter, from heading, from subheading, that refers to the HS code. And then if it refers to a chapter, it means a lot of products. If it's a heading, it's products that are under that heading. And then subheading means it only applies to only a very, very few products. So you always have to work backwards on your rules of origin qualification to work with the HS code of your finished product and the HS code of your components. And so this is how rules of origin work. And so the good thing is that CUSMA, there's been hardly any change on that under the rules of origin. And then the last point, yes, the free trade agreement certificate of origin. So that is, these are the main components of all free trade agreements. And really, as far as rules of origin, there are very few changes in CUSMA. CUSMA is a bit wider than NAFTA was because it added some components, some chapters on environment rules or environment issues, on labor issues, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a bit wider than NAFTA, but not that much. And so the industries that have been impacted the most really are the automobile industry. And I'll show you exactly what it looks like, what the changes are. There's small changes for textiles, for chemicals, for cosmetics as well. The NAFTA certificate of origin that I showed you earlier, it's been replaced by a new process. There are important changes that the US insisted on that we don't like very much, but we have no choice. We had no choice because, as you remember, the former US president just wanted to have things his way. He had a big ego. And so one of the things we had to accept was to have an expiry date. CUSMA has an expiry date, 16 years, whereas NAFTA was like a marriage contract. It had no expiry date, It was good for as long as it was good. So CUSMA has a 16-year lifespan. So in 2036, it will go up in smoke, and we'll have to do a new one. And it has a 6-year automatic review process, which I think is fine. The US gives itself a right of veto on other free trade agreements, which is highly questionable, but there's not too much we can do about that. And we opened our market, we agreed to open our market for additional dairy products. And so that's also criticized a little bit in Canada. Why is it criticized in Canada, or why is that important in Canada? Is because we protect our dairy industry in Canada. You may have heard of that, the supply management system that we have. So dairy, milk, cheese, yogurt, poultry, chicken meat, turkey meat, eggs and egg products are protected in the sense that we have production quotas. We also have the government fixes prices, minimum prices for these products, and we try to prevent imports of these products by having quotas on imports. So what that means is that if you import dairy products in Canada, there's extremely high duties to pay. It's something like 300%. So we want to prevent Canada from being invaded by US or other foreign dairy products and this and that. And so that's why, the US criticizes that and wanted us to dismantle that system, but we were able to keep it. And we just had to agree to increase the proportion of quota that was given to US dairy producers. So this is what the story is about CUSMA. And so additional opening for US dairy, milk, and egg products. We had to agree on that. We had no choice. The US wanted us to dismantle that system. So luckily we resisted. Now, from a customs point of view, these are just the main customs documents that are used when we export goods to the US and they go to the border. The customs process has not changed at all. The customs forms have not changed at all. It's all exactly the same. Now, on the big changes, as I said a moment ago, was for the automobile industry and some minor changes for other industries, which I'll show you in a moment. And so where do we find the information? CUSMA has 34 chapters. The most important chapter for exporters really is chapter 4, because this is where you find the rules of origin. And then you see textiles is in a separate chapter. And that shows us that the rules for textiles are always more complex in free trade agreements. So textile has its own section. The free trade agreement that we have been talking about for a while, what you can do is you can fold it neatly, and then make a paper plane with it, and then say goodbye to your certificate of origin because it has been abolished. It's been replaced by a new process, an origin certification process that does not have to be on a specific form. Like there's no more actual form required. You can incorporate your origin certification on your commercial invoice, for example. The only thing, what is new also is that the importer can issue the origin certification. So that's new. It's been presented by some people as being something very interesting and very positive, when we talk about improvements, but in reality, let's be honest about it. It makes absolutely no sense for an importer to provide an origin certification on a product, because the origin certification, it's only the producer and the exporter who knows that the product qualifies, right? Who knows how the product is made. So an importer should never provide an origin certification unless he has that from the exporter. And if he has that from the exporter, well, then the exporter might as well present the origin certification. So it's really the fact that the importer can sign the origin certification is a false improvement. It doesn't change anything at all, because importers have no reason whatsoever to issue an origin certification if they don't have a backup from the exporter. So that's one of the changes. And then the big changes, as I said a couple of times already, is for the automobile industry. And so I want to show you what the new rules look like. So for automobiles, if you're, remember I told you we have several automobile assembly plants in Ontario. We have GMs, we have Ford, we have Toyota, Honda, Chrysler. So the rule for these automobile assembly factories is they had to have at least 62.5 regional content under NAFTA, and now that has been increased to 75%. So If you're Honda Canada in Ontario, where they assemble Honda Civics, they have to have at least 75% of their components have to come from Canada, US, or Mexico. Before it was 62.5. So it makes it more difficult for them because they have to source more products locally. So it's not that it makes it more difficult, but it can make it more complicated and possibly more costly. If you're the Hino factory in Woodbridge, which assembles the Hino trucks, then your percentage went from 60% to 70%. And then there's an additional rule, is that all this on the steel and aluminum that's included in a vehicle has to originate, at least 70% of it has to originate in North America. So you see the thresholds have been increased and there's been more conditions put to it in order to meet the rules of origin and in order for these automobiles, these vehicles to enter, to travel between Canada, the US, and Mexico free of duties, free of taxes. It's the same with parts. If you're a parts manufacturer, and we have some in BC, and there's many across Canada who supply the automobile industry, your percentages went up for your parts. You know, if you're making batteries, or if you're making rims, or whatever parts, automobile parts you make, or truck parts you make, you have to have a higher percentage of local content now, of regional content. So that was the big change for the automobile industry. And as if that was not bad enough, they also introduced, CUSMA also introduces a labor value content. So a certain percentage of these vehicles assembled in Canada or in the US must be made with labor that's paid at least $16 an hour. So that's clearly a clause that is working against Mexico. So it's favorable in Canada. In Canada, it's okay because we would comply. But in Mexico, it makes it difficult. So the intent here from the US side, they insisted on that. The intent is that the US wants to prevent automobile companies to shift, to open plants in Mexico. They want basically companies to open plants in the US only. So that was the reasoning behind it. And so, of course, there was a transition period for that because you can't adjust to these things overnight. So as you can see, the big impact really of CUSMA is for the automobile industry. For all other industries, there's been no change whatsoever in terms of rules of origin and et cetera, et cetera. So I'll give you a few examples of some other minor changes. For example, if you're in the textile industry, and we do have quite a few textile companies garment companies in Quebec that still make, you know, suits and dresses and slacks and that. So you see, with the new rules on the CUSMA, the thread that you use must be originating. So you cannot import thread or elastics anymore to include them in a garment that you make in Canada or in Mexico or in the US. So you see, we've had minor changes like this on some items for kits, you know, goods that are sold in kits. The rules of origin are much more difficult because under NAFTA, you had to have, if you sold something in a kit, you know, and then we do sell cosmetics sometimes in kits, or tools, you know, there's many things that are sold in kits. And so before, you just had to go with the overall content and meet a percentage, you know, a certain percentage of regional content. So it was relatively easy. Now, if you sell goods in kits, each item that is part of the kit must be originating. So it makes things much more difficult, and it forces company to use local products as opposed to imported products in a kit. One provision that is favorable, sorry for having all these texts, but basically in a nutshell, what it is it allows you, it facilitates recycling. So let's say you have an engine or some piece of machinery that came from China or India or wherever, and you're going to refurbish it in order to, you know, bring it up to standard and in order to extend its life. When you refurbish it, it becomes a local product. So the refurbishing process, the recycling process, enables you to say, okay, I've recycled this, I've refurbished this motor, this engine in Canada, so that it becomes Canadian, it complies with the CUSMA rules of origin, and before it was not the case. So it encourages, it's quite positive because it encourages recycling and recovering materials. And now, one last change I want to share with you is about the tax and duty exemption that was renegotiated under the CUSMA agreement. And there, what's interesting is that there was a huge difference between our three countries, between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, is that the US has a very high tax and duty exemption of $800. So what that means is that if you're a US consumer, you can buy products online from anywhere in the world as long as they are not worth more than $800. They come into the US duty free. So it's a crazy high amount that in fact, you know, we all know that e-commerce has exploded with the pandemic, right? But before that, e-commerce was extremely, had grown a lot also, particularly in the US. And the reason why e-commerce has grown a lot in the US in pre-pandemic times is because of this, very high duty-free exemption of $800, because it really encouraged people to buy foreign goods. So it was a bit like an official legal tax evasion in a way, you know, very unfair for traditional retailers and distributors, because if you're a wholesaler or retailer in shoes and you have stores, and when you bring your shoes in, you pay duties on them, right? You pay duties and taxes. But if you're a Chinese shoe exporter and you sell them online, a US client can buy them online and pay no duties and taxes at all. So it's very unfair for brick and mortar retailers, for traditional retailers. But that's how it is in the US. And so, of course, the US e-commerce industry was complaining about the fact that Canada had such a low duty and tax exemption. The limit in Canada, it was $20 before CUSMA. So, which means that as a Canadian consumer, anytime you buy something overseas, online or whatnot, then as soon as it exceeds $20, you pay duties and taxes. You pay duties if they're applicable, and you pay GST. And so the US wanted us to increase that because their US, e-commerce industry was complaining about the fact that the $20 limit made it hard to sell goods in Canada, was preventing them from doing more business in Canada. And so it was the same thing in Mexico. I don't know what the limit was in Mexico before CUSMA, but both Canada and Mexico were put under pressure to increase their duty and tax exemption. So we in Canada accepted to increase it to $40, from $20 to $40, and from $20 to $150 for duties. And the US agreed to do something relatively similar, increase their threshold. So from that moment on, then, and so we resisted going to 800. Of course, we didn't want to go as high as 800, but so we sort of negotiated something that was somewhat in between. So that is very important for e-commerce merchants. And of course, this guy, whom you'll probably recognize, was very happy about it. And but this other chap was also very happy about it. And who was not happy about it? I'll tell you, it's these people. They were not happy about it. And I'll tell you exactly why on the next slide. And so the reason why, and this is very odd actually, is that, I'm sorry, there's a lot of text there, but in a nutshell, what it is that the higher limit only applies for goods that are coming into Canada via courier companies. So if you buy goods online and they come in via FedEx, DHL, Purolator, DHL, UPS and whatnot, then you get the higher duty and tax exemption, the tax exemption of 40 and the duty exemption of 150. If the goods come in via the post office, via Canada Post, then the limit is still at 20. So you'll save money on duties and taxes if your goods come in via a private courier company like a UPS or a FedEx. And you'll pay more if your goods come via Canada Post, because you'll pay duties and taxes. And so it's extremely, again, one of those things that's extremely unfair, extremely bizarre, because we're favoring the private industry to the detriment of a public institution. So very bizarre, but that's the reality. And the other thing that's strange about this measure is that the duty exemption, the higher duty exemption, is does not apply only on US and Mexican products. In fact, it applies on any origin of products, so long as they are shipped from the US or Mexico. So if you buy a Chinese-made pair of boots and it's shipped via a US distribution center, then you don't pay duties on the first $150. So very bizarre as well, but that's how it is. That's what we negotiated, and that's the result. So this has quite an impact on e-commerce, on the e-commerce industry. And so I wanted to finish early, so we have a bit of time for questions. So that brings me to the end of what I had prepared for you, to talk about CUSMA and the new free trade agreement, to give you a glimpse of it, to show you that it's actually not very different from the previous one, contrary to what the US president said. But of course, we use the fact that the former US president never really said anything right or true. So, so CUSMA is really a cut and paste of NAFTA with a few minor exceptions I showed you for chemicals, cosmetics, textiles. But the big impact really was for the automobile industry. For the automobile industry, it's more difficult now to comply with NAFTA or with CUSMA. We need to have more local content, so it might drive prices up. That's the disadvantage of that. So we don't know in the long term. We don't know that these provisions might make the Canadian automobile industry or even the whole North American automobile industry less competitive than other automobile industries. And so that's what I wanted to show you for CUSMA. And I want to end with a smile. We live in tough times with the pandemic and with these border closings caused by these so-called freedom convoys, and that so let's end with a smile. Let's be optimistic and underline the fact that we have great free trade agreements. We have this CUSMA free trade agreement with Mexico and the US. We also have the CETA free trade agreement with the 27 countries of the European Union, plus the UK. And we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership that links us with Japan, with Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, etc. And so our exporters are well equipped with these free trade agreements to expand their markets. And our manufacturers and importers are also well equipped to source finished products or raw materials or components and parts from these areas and be more competitive that way. So I hope I didn't go too fast. I wanted to keep an eye on the clock and make sure that we have time at the end. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you want to share anything with, I'd be really happy to. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation and that you found it useful and that you learned a few things. So thank you again for your attention, and I'm looking forward to exchanging with you.
Hello, Christian. Thanks so much for your presentation. Was I think in the right pace, and thanks so much for not covering the COVID situation. I think everything was pretty clear and really knowledgeable about the NAFTA 2.0. We do have a few questions that the students have mentioned here, and I would also encourage you, if you have not had the chance, look at the chat and follow the link, and you can write your questions. There's still time. Right now, I'm gonna ask you to stop sharing your screen, Christian, so we can open
Absolutely.
for questions from our students. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Perla, would you like to share your screen?
Yeah, I'm gonna share it. Can you see the questions? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Oh, give me a second.
Yes, so 78% of companies don't use or fully understand trade
Give
agreements.
me a second, Christian. I'll read it for you. Just give me a second. I'm fixing here. Okay. So yeah, 79% of companies don't use or fully understand trade agreement. What's the best way and moment to invest in the tech and tackle this opportunity?
Yes, anytime you have to you can tackle these opportunities anytime. The important thing is to make yourself well aware of the rules of origin, and so that you can figure out what's the best way to can you sell your product in the free trade agreement zone? Can you, or do you need to, if you're a manufacturer, do you need to change some of your sourcing in order to, so that your product qualifies? So I think the key is that we should use, some of these free trade agreements are underutilized, and so we should look into it immediately. There's no point in delaying. The main thing is to become familiar with the rules of origin, so that we know we can, to make sure that our product qualifies, and so we don't miss opportunities. Also, we don't want to say that our product qualifies and sign a free trade a certificate of origin, and then find out afterwards through a customs audit that our product is not qualified, and then we end up with paying penalties. So really do our homework, and if necessary, adjust our sourcing. See, if we make something today and it's not, and it doesn't meet the percentage of rules of origin, then can we change or can we modify our sourcing? Can we buy more components locally? Maybe it will cost us a bit more, but it will help us get a higher percentage, and then it will enable our product to be compliant with the free trade agreement and get the duty-free exemption.
Perfect, thank you. The next question, can certificate of origin be considered a bill of lading?
A bill of lading, yes or no. So a certificate of origin only attests the compliance of the product to a rule of origin, and also it confirms that a product originates from the stated country. Whereas a bill of lading is a shipping document, so it's a contract. You know, a bill of lading is a shipping contract between the seller, the transport company, and the buyer. And sometimes a bill of lading can also be a kind of title of ownership. For an original ocean bill of lading, it's what we call it, a document of title. So it's not at all the same as a certificate of origin. But the important thing about a certificate of origin, particularly free trade agreement, is that it's a legally binding document. You know, if we sign it, it means that our product complies with the rule of origin. And so customs can come to us at any time and ask us to prove that. And they can also ask us to prove that retroactively over the last 6 years. And if we don't comply with the rule of origin, then we would get penalties. We'd be assessed punitive duties, you know, but plus penalties. So it's a very serious document. We have to take it seriously, and it's a legally binding document from an exporter's point of view.
Thank you. Next question. Which tier of suppliers in the car manufacturing industry in Canada is affected the most by CUSMA?
So I would say the ones that are affected the most are the manufacturers, the car assembly, vehicle assemblies, because they have higher percentages of products to meet. Plus, they have these labor content to meet as well, so it makes it tricky. But it's the same thing for tier 2 or tier 3 manufacturers. They themselves still have to like the percentages of regional content have increased for parts manufacturers as well. So they're all impacted because they all have to procure more goods locally. And so potentially procuring more goods locally means potentially higher costs.
Thank you. Next question. Is rules of origin a specific document for CUSMA trade agreements? Can it be used for other trade agreements?
No, each trade agreement has a specific form or a specific format, shall we say. So no, you use, yeah. So every trade agreement has its own form or its own process.
Perfect, thank you. Next question. The duty taxes exemption applies for all purchases around the world or only for purchases from US and Mexico?
They apply to purchases made anywhere around the world or with products from any origin. So we talk about the Canadian exemption, right? the duty tax exemption in Canada. So it applies to any products of any origin, so long as they have been shipped from the US or Mexico. So long as they went through a US or Mexican distribution center. So this is a very odd provision because usually duties are based on the origin of products. And here it's not the case. Duties or duty-free exemption is based on where the products were shipped from.
Perfect. Next question. Some countries have 8-digit NHS codes, others 10. What happens when Canada exports a product with a 10-digit HS code to a country which has an 8-digit code?
Well, actually, it's not 100% correct. A complete HS code has 10 digits. And so the first 6 digits are international, which means that the first 6 digits on any product should be the same everywhere around the world, but the last 4 digits can vary in each country. So really, the full HS code has 10 digits, and you show the 10 digits on the customs documentation. You show the 10 digits of the country where you file the documentation. Let's say when you export from Canada and you file an export declaration, you have to show the Canadian 10-digit HS code on the export declaration. But when if you ship goods to the US, there you show the US 10-digit HS code on the import declaration. So that's how the HS code works.
Perfect, thank you. Next question. How can China benefit from CUSMA e-commerce?
Well, I mean, China should not benefit from CUSMA, but unfortunately they do. Well, not directly. No, they don't benefit directly. What China benefits from the high US duty-free exemption of $800. So the US has a very high duty-free exemption. So China, like every country, will benefit from that because they can sell goods to US consumers as long as they don't exceed $800. The US consumer pays no taxes, no duties at all. So aside from that, no, China does not benefit from CUSMA. I'm not sure why they should actually.
Okay. Okay.
If I may speak, that was my question.
Yes, clarify. No problem. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's just that in the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned about either Mexico, Canada purchasing supplies from other countries.
Yes.
Before doing the raw material.
Yep.
So I thought this could be a benefit for China because mainly those supplies are way cheaper coming from.
Yes, correct. Yes, it is. The
Okay.
fact that we allow a certain proportion of foreign content. Yes, it's a benefit to China. Yes, that's right. Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay, thank
Thank
you. And the last question, in a company who is in charge to ensure the rule of origin is correct to avoid any problems or penalties, is there a specific position?
That's a very nice question, and it's not so easy to answer because on the one hand, it's the exporter who is responsible for the certificate of origin. So the exporter will sign the form and will say, okay, my product complies with the rules of origin. On the other hand, once the goods goes across the border, it's the importer who gets the benefit, right? It's the importer who pays the duties and taxes or who pays no duties because the goods come in free because they're part of the free trade agreement. So if customs in the country of destination finds that the product does not comply with the rules of origin, they'll issue the penalty to the importer. So it's strictly speaking, it's the exporter who is responsible, but if there's penalties, they will go against the importer because it's always on the importing side that this will be challenged. You know, that customs will say, okay, no, we gave duty-free we gave duty-free entry to this product, whereas it's not qualified, so it should pay 18% duties or 15% or whatever it is, then they would, customs in the country of arrival will always go against the importer for additional duties and for penalties. They will not go to the exporter. And so in strictly speaking, the exporter is responsible. In practice, The importer will get the penalties if something is wrong, and then he then has to go after the exporter to get compensated.
Perfect. Thank you, Christian.
You're
we'll
welcome.
check if there are any other questions on the chat.
We still have
No,
enough time, so don't hesitate.
okay. We don't have more questions on the chat of the Zoom or the
Okay.
other application. We would like to